smile, guys, when you're talking, control the conversation. You know exactly what you're doing. There's nothing more that we can do for you. We're proud of you regardless. Just go have fun.
Relax and have fun. You've got this, guys.
Okay, here we go. Let me go get the judges for you. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back, judges. This is Fall Creek Junior High Unit 5, their last session for the day and ours as well. So happy Sunday for all of us here as we're working through, and thank you for your hard work into getting this far. I'm Mark McCall. I'm your timer and facilitator still for the day. If it's okay with you, just like we did yesterday, we'll do the green background with 1 minute left and a yellow background when your 4 minutes and your 8 minutes time is up. Otherwise, this hand that keeps appearing back here is my 4-year-old son. So we're going to go on mute now so we can enjoy what you're saying. And I'm going to turn it over to the judges.
Welcome back and congratulations again to you and your teachers and coaches. We're so glad you're here and we're happy to be here too. And we saved the best for last, right? Okay. My name is Rebecca Tinder. I am a retired attorney from Charleston, West Virginia, and the West Virginia We the People coordinator. And we are.
I'm Lindsay Draper, and I'm glad to see you again. Also, currently, I am Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Institute for Wellbeing in Law.
Hello, everybody. I'm still Candida Steele and still retired from being a judge on the U.S. Civilian Board of Contract Appeals, and very glad to be back to see you all today.
And remind us who you are.
Hi, I'm Mary Heinen.
I'm Nana Powerdman.
I'm Trey McDonald.
I'm Elena Thompson.
I'm Ellie Philhauer, and we're reading for Fall Creek Junior High. Our sponsors are Patrick Bradshaw and Jeannie Medeiros.
Great. By process of elimination, we're going to do question 2, which says political and social movements in American history have been successful because of the right of assembly. President Abraham Lincoln wrote in a letter that, quote, the right of the peaceable assembly, end quote, is part of the, quote, constitutional substitute for revolution, end quote. Do you agree or disagree with President Lincoln? Why? What historical or contemporary evidence is there, if any, that political and social movements have led to significant changes in laws or policies? What limits, if any, should be placed on the right of freedom of assembly? You may begin.
We agree with President Abraham Lincoln that the right to peaceful assembly is a constitutional substitute for revolution. Without freedom of assembly, our country will not be able to move forward, as one individual's voice doesn't speak as loud as a body of people fighting against injustice.
A critical part of a free nation is the right to peaceably assemble, as it is a substitute for revolution.
The injustice caused by the lack of freedom of assembly in colonial America led the founders to believe that it was an essential pillar of democracy. During colonial times, the Massachusetts Government Act of 1774 limited the number of town assemblies permitted in a year, as discussion during those times included talk of overthrowing the British government. Later that year, after the Constitutional Convention, the colonies wrote the Declaration of Resolves, where it states
that they have the right to peaceably assemble.
Marginalized groups in our society traditionally use the rights to peacefully assemble to protect their political views.
The women's suffrage movement shows how an overlooked group can make legislative change by the passing of the 19th Amendment. Elizabeth Cady Stanton at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1849 stated,
we are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed.
Peaceful political and social movements have created policy changes without the need for revolution. In the 1930s, labor unions were becoming more prominent throughout the United States, fighting for a better work environment. In 1938, the Fair Standards Act was passed by Congress, in which it defined minimum wage, overtime pay, and youth employment standards.
Freedom of assembly led to significant changes in America during the Civil Rights Movement. It led to increased awareness and acceptance of African American rights and eventually desegregation in schools through Sweat v. Painter and Brown v. Board of Education. A significant change also made by the Civil Rights Movement is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on race, religion, color, national origin, and sex.
The environmental movement began on April 22nd, 1970, in which 20 million Americans protested following the Santa Barbara oil spill in 1969. Following the protests, the National Environmental Policy Act was passed.
One movement that is still prominent in today's society is the fight for LGBTQ+ rights. Romy B. Evans and Lawrence v. Texas protect members of this community from discrimination, and in 2015, Birchville v. Hodges legalized same-sex marriage in all 50 states. The Equality Act was written to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. Black Lives Matter is a political crusade that advocates for the end of racially motivated police brutality. After the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, cities have passed policies restricting no-knock warrants and law enforcement's use of chokeholds.
Limits that should be placed on freedom of assembly include protesting on private property and at health facilities and riots. Adderley v. Florida determined that we not protest on private property. Protests at healthcare facilities, such as COVID vaccine facilities, cause a distribution delay and put people vulnerable to COVID-19 at risk. The case Hill v. Colorado declared that states can put limits on protesters at abortion clinics. In this case, the court stated that this
is not a regulation of speech. Rather, it is a regulation of the places where some speech may occur.
When it comes to riots, protesters who loot, trespass, or threaten the safety of others should be arrested. United States v. Charles Matthews and Feener v. New York have determined that riots are not protected under freedom of assembly. The New York draft riot occurred in 1863 as a violent uproar against mandatory draft in the Civil War. This is defined as a riot by the 18 U.S. Code section 2102, where it states,
The term riot means a public disturbance involving an act or acts of violence.
riots are not a form of peaceful assembly and therefore are not protected by the Constitution.
multiple cases and movements have transformed the United States and have made changes through the rights of peaceable assembly. We are now prepared for your questions.
Thank you. In the Supreme Court case of DeYoung versus Oregon, the court held that freedom of assembly was as important as freedom of speech. Do you agree or disagree? And explain.
I agree with this statement, as freedom of speech cannot be seen as great as it cannot be seen unless you are in a big setting with a lot of people, as freedom of assembly is used.
I
agree.
respectfully, oh, sorry, you may go, Nana.
I agree with my colleague Ellie. For example, you have to use freedom of speech to use freedom of assembly, and they all are used together. So if you don't have freedom of speech used and freedom of assembly, most of the time your cause will not be put out.
I respectfully disagree with both my colleagues, Ellie and Nana. I believe that freedom of speech is more important, as freedom of assembly would be not important, wouldn't it be useless unless if we didn't have the right to freedom of speech, because freedom of speech is used in freedom of assembly.
If there were, for instance, 1 million men marching down the street in silence, or a few 100,000 people protesting, oh, I don't know, dairy products, don't you think somebody would pay attention even if there were no conversation? Even if all they did was carry signs? Doesn't the sheer number get your attention?
I believe that the sheer number of people assembling does get people's attention just as much as freedom of speech does, as we saw with the Montgomery bus boycott in the 1960s, where Rosa Parks and other African Americans boycotted buses because they made African Americans sit in the back instead of in the front with white citizens. And so I believe that the sheer number of people assembling does make just as much impact as people speaking out verbally.
Okay, thanks.
Candida, you're muted.
I'm sorry. You mentioned the Adderley case and protesting on private property. Can you tell us more about that?
So the Adderley case prevented protesters on a private jail property. And this can also correlate to buffer zones put in place by and abortion clinics. And this is also seen in the case McCullen v. Coakley, where there in Massachusetts, there was a 35-foot ban around an abortion clinic to prevent protesters from hassling the people who are using the abortion clinic.
To add on to what my colleague Nana said, the individuals who were arrested were convicted under trespassing with malicious intent.
In looking at court cases, there have been limits placed besides, a buffer zone. What other limits have been placed on assembly, and are they justified or have they gone too far?
One example of limits placed on assembly is in the case Cox v. New Hampshire, where they decided that they could place reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on people. And I do not believe that this is going too far because they are not controlling the content of these people's speech.
An example of where time can be limited can be seen during wartime. In the case Debs, the United States, Eugene Debs delivered a speech trying to get people to protest the draft during World War I. He was arrested under the Espionage Act of 1917 for trying to cause insubordination in the military. He appealed, saying that this was a violation of his First Amendment rights, although the court sided with the US, saying that wartime is a special instance where a speech can be limited.
And do you agree with that? Do you agree with that kind of limits during wartime?
I do agree with those types of limits during wartime, because if your country's in a vulnerable place and you don't want to be using your speech to essentially create disruption for the people who are going, and you want it to be like safe for other people. So using your freedom of speech during that time will not be effective, and it wouldn't be very smart.
To add on to what my
Go ahead.
To add on to what my colleague Nana said, I do agree. As Shank the United States has found is very similar to Debs the United States, and was convicted on the Espionage Act of 1917.
So I am clearly from a different era than you. When I was your age, our country was fighting a military activity in Vietnam. And although it started with huge support for what was happening, there were a number of protests all over the country, mainly led by young people of draft age, that eventually changed our country to the point that we got out. How is that different from what you just talked about?
Can you please restate the question?
Can't protests sometimes point out to the government, you all are blowing it, you're doing it wrong?
Absolutely.
Go
You
ahead,
go.
Nina. Okay. I do believe that protests can point out in certain cases when your country is not in a favorable position during war. The United States was known to be losing the Vietnam War to the Soviets, and many people wanted to have the US withdraw from Vietnam, because not only were we losing lives, we were losing a bunch of money and materials, and we were not making any ground.
But I guess, the point I want to make is, wasn't that the same thing that we just talked about, where we are at war, you should support the country? And I'm asking you, might you want to consider not necessarily as an answer?
I do not believe them to be the same thing, mainly by the amount of numbers in the protests. Those who were convicted in the Espionage Act was, as seen in Shank, was only a couple. However, there was sheer numbers in protesting. And I feel like when there's multiple people, that then it does become more of a government concern.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. You talked about the Vietnam War and the UN losing the war to Soviets. Was it the Soviets we were fighting in Vietnam? maybe not. I think we're about to, what's the time, Mark?
Have still about 20 seconds.
Oh, a quick one. We've talked about rights. What responsibilities do people have when they're attending an assembly or a protest?
I believe that they have the responsibility to remain peaceful, as to show like they can get their point across without being violent, as we saw during the civil rights movement and the women's suffrage movement. May I finish my thought, please?
Sure. Yes.
Where we had many peaceful assemblies and they did get their point across and made significant legislative change.
Great, what a great job.
Great job. Wanted to keep talking, and that's always a good sign. You've covered a lot of ground in your 4-minute presentation. I was running out of room on the paper to write. And I particularly appreciated your reference to the Seneca and the quote from Ms. Staten and the LGBTQ plus, and you went all the way through the abortion case and way back to 1863. So you just covered a huge amount of ground there. I also liked that you were able to analyze the questions with the information that you have learned, and you were able to pull out cases when we were talking about the questions. You pulled in the Cox versus New Hampshire and the Schenck case, Macaulay case. So you were able to apply them appropriately is what I'm trying to say. And I think you really have shown us an understanding of the topic. And I really appreciated our conversation. Congratulations to you all and to your teachers and coaches. Really good job in these really trying times.
I truly hope that you're proud of yourselves. I know that your teachers are proud of you. As I'm watching, it's really kind of interesting when you put this much energy into something. You all want to be perfect, and you want to say, "We nailed that," and you don't want anything to have left on the table. Let me just sort of tell you that would have never happened. You will always leave something on the table, and part of it is because there's no way to talk about everything. At some point tonight, you're going to think, "Oh, I wish I had said that," or I could have said the following. You gave an amazing litany of information at the beginning. It's been really, they're judgment calls that you have to make when you're an adult talking to young people. And for instance, I don't recall having heard anybody mention abortion rights and protests at clinics before this round. That has been something that has obviously been on my mind, but you have to make a decision. Is that something you bring up to teenagers? I can't tell you how impressed I was that you realized some of the things that have impacted this discussion aren't always things we're going to agree on. Some of them are going to be things that bring about both moral, religious, health, and all kinds of considerations. But people feel strongly enough about them that they want to be heard. And that's what the import is in having assembly, is that sometimes you're not going to get folks to talk about the stuff that you care about unless you make them talk about it. And you all did a really good job of dramatizing that. So I can't say enough good things about you. You really did well, and congratulations to you.
I agree with both my colleagues. I thought that was a really lovely job, and chock full is right. Not only talking about LGBTQ and BLM and Brown, but to talk about the Environmental Policy Act and George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and protesting on private property and abortion clinics and the draft riots. And I mean, you really just covered the whole ball of wax. It was really very impressive. So thank you. I'm really pleased that you were such a strong team at the end, because I don't know about everybody else, but I'm kind of exhausted. So it's really exciting to have you all get us all enthused again. Thank you. You did a really stunning job. I hope you be enthused and excited about doing this and follow it on your own and pay attention to the paper and watch the news and know what's going on in the world, because we need you to know that. Thank you. It's been wonderful talking with you.
Thank you, team. Thank you, Ms. Medeiros and Mr. Bradshaw, for your efforts and your support of your students as you work through this. Students, that's it. Thank you. Congratulations.
Mark, you froze up.
Enjoy the rest of your Sunday and good luck in your academics as you move forward.
Congratulations.